Nicomachean Ethics. What is the chief end of man? As you quite possibly know, this is the first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. You might even be able to rehearse the answer: to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And this is certainly the right answer. What you might not be aware of, however, is that it is a really profound question. One that has occupied the minds not only of theologians, but also of philosophers down through the ages. Take a look at your own life and the lives of those around you. It is pretty obvious that we all do the things we do for a reason. Take brushing your teeth, for instance. Why do you do it? Because your parents told you to? Or to make sure you have fresh breath? To prevent tooth decay? Any or all of these may be the right answer for you, and there are probably many others I did not list. The point is this: whenever you perform any action, you are doing it for some reason. It is just part of being human. Now, brushing one's teeth is not the sort of thing philosophers examine. They do not simply try to discern our reason for doing some particular action. Rather, they try and discover why we do everything we do. That is, they want to know what we are seeking in life, what we are aiming at. To use Westminster's language, they want to know what our chief end is. It is to people who want to answer this question that Aristotle addresses his Nicomachean Ethics. General information, author, and context. Aristotle, Plato's most brilliant disciple and founder of the Lyceum, is a man who perhaps needs no great introduction. Known simply as the philosopher throughout the Middle Ages, he is one of the most influential thinkers in the Western intellectual tradition. In addition to his skill as a philosopher, however, Aristotle was something of a polymath. He was interested in all sorts of things. Polymath. This intellectual curiosity led him to coin both the names for such academic disciplines as logic, rhetoric, physics, and meteorology, but also the terms employed in these fields of study. It is a special testament to his genius that the study of formal logic meant the study of Aristotle's logical writings for some 2,000 years after his death. Aristotle was born in Stegria, Thrace, in 384 or 3 BC. His father, Nicomachean, was a physician and a friend of the Macedonian king, Amyntas II. This connection with Macedonian royalty would prove to be both a great opportunity and a great liability in Aristotle's life. In 368 or 7, he moved to Athens, where he would study with Plato at the academy for the next 20 years. When Plato died, Aristotle spent a brief time as the director of the branch of the academy in Assos before moving to Macedonia to become the tutor of the then 13-year-old Alexander the Great. He would keep this position for 7 years. When Alexander ascended his father's throne in 336, Aristotle returned to Athens to found his own school, the Lyceum. Aristotle spent the rest of his working career at the Lyceum in Athens. It is during this 12-year period that he composed his most important works, including the Nicomachean Ethics. After Alexander the Great's unexpected death in 323, anti-Macedonian sentiments were on the rise in Athens, and Aristotle was suspect due to his and his family's Macedonian connections. In order to escape almost certain death, Aristotle left Athens. He spent the year 322, which was his last, living in exile on his mother's estate in Euboea. Significance. We have all probably heard Socrates' famous maxim, "The unexamined life is not worth living." They are wise words indeed, and one would do well to remember them. But according to Mortimer Adler, in his great little book, Aristotle for Everybody, Aristotle himself took it back one step further. For him, the unplanned life is not worth examining. To examine your life without knowing what it is you are aiming at is kind of like Alice asking the Cheshire Cat what the right way is when she doesn't know where she's going. There is no real way of making a decision without a goal. The Nicomachean Ethics is significant because it focuses our attention on the vitally important issue of the purpose of human life. Furthermore, after focusing our attention, it then helps us to discover the surest course to achieve that purpose. Although Aristotle was not a Christian, he lived 3 centuries before Christ, his exhortation here to live circumspectly is clearly in line with the teaching of the Scriptures. Moreover, the Nicomachean Ethics has further significance for people in our own day. Aristotle notes that some people in his day had argued that the purpose of life is to have as much pleasure as possible, while others argued for wealth, power, or honor instead. Still others argued that the attainment of virtue is the real goal of life. In short, there were in his day any number of conflicting opinions about the purpose of life. The thoughtful person will see that we find ourselves in a similar situation today. The Nicomachean Ethics is a useful tool not only in learning to ask the right questions and think about important matters, but they also help us to make sense of our own world in our own time. Summary and setting. The Nicomachean Ethics is best described in the following 3 ways. It is teleological, for Aristotle assumes that all human actions are directed toward a telos, Greek for end or goal. He understands this goal to be what he calls in Greek eudaimonia, which means felicity, happiness, or the good life. Hence, Aristotle's work here is often called eudaimonistic by philosophers. Finally, it is practical. Aristotle argues that the good life is not achieved merely by thinking about what constitutes a good life, but by putting those ideas into practice. A brief outline of the text goes as follows. In Book 1, Aristotle notes that all human actions are teleological and that the telos they are striving for ultimately is eudaimonia or happiness. He then sets limits on his work, saying that the conclusions he will reach in his argument will be probable rather than certain. This is due to the fact that ethical reasoning is largely based on inductive arguments, those that attempt to arrive at general principles by studying particular instances, rather than deductive arguments, those that attempt to understand the particular things in light of general principles. In books 2 through 5, Aristotle defines moral virtue, considers how it is acquired, and discusses the individual moral virtues at length. Key to this part of the text is Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean, by which he shows that the virtues are performed by avoiding extremes, either of deficiency or excess in any action. In Book 6, he discusses the intellectual virtues, while in Book 7 he considers pleasure. Books 8 and 9 contain Aristotle's famous philosophy concerning friendship, while the whole work is drawn to a close with a consideration of happiness in Book 10. Worldview. Written in the mid-century BC, the Nicomachean Ethics is one of the most frequently studied works of one of the most important philosophers in Western history. It was read widely in Aristotle's day and has continued to captivate the minds of the greatest philosophers ever since, especially since its reintroduction to Europe in the High Middle Ages 750 years ago. When reading an ancient book, it is hard to imagine that it was once a novelty, but this is precisely what the Nicomachean Ethics was in many ways. For Aristotle's was the first work ever to be written on the subject of ethics, the branch of philosophy concerned with evaluating human actions. Now it is true that Plato's dialogues display an intense concern for ethical truth. This is especially the case in his Republic, where he focuses upon justice and the ordering of the ideal society. But Plato, seeing man's good to be identical with the good of the state, fails to address man as man. He simply describes the ordering of the good state and assumes that it will be good for the man as well. It was Aristotle, however, who first took a serious look at human nature and action in order to explain what the good of man was and how it could be achieved. The influence of the Nicomachean Ethics has had in Western civilization is great, both inside and outside the church. In the Greco-Roman world, Aristotle's teachings were embraced by the Peripatetics, the name given to Aristotle's followers because they walked around while he taught them. While a good number of his ethical ideas were also embodied in various other philosophical schools, such as the Stoics and Epicureans. Christian thought about ethics has also been greatly influenced by Aristotle. To give two notable examples, the great medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas produced what many scholars think to be the most profound commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, and the influential 16th century Protestant reformer Peter Martyr Vermigli is noted for his fine commentary as well. Potential difficulties. The fact that the Nicomachean Ethics is an influential work notwithstanding, the Christian reader is often unsure of the value or even the legitimacy of studying ethics from someone who was, frankly, a pagan. For writing 350 years before the coming of Christ and ignorant of the Lord's revelation of himself to Israel, Aristotle never even conceives of the triune God, much less addresses him in his work. Although this fact should not surprise us, it does necessarily raise a difficult question about the value of reading Aristotle for the thoughtful Christian. Christians have disagreed over this issue, but for those who value the study of Aristotle's ethics, the following three principles are most important. First, as Christians, we affirm that although all men are sinners in Adam, we are nevertheless made in God's image and after his likeness. This truth applies even to pre-Christian pagans like Aristotle. As a bearer of God's image, we should expect him to express important truths about many areas of human life and experience, sometimes even very profound ones. As a fallen sinner, however, we should not be surprised to find great errors as well. Second, we believe with Psalm 119 that the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night after night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Simply put, there is truth to be found by giving attention to the world that God has made, Aristotle was deeply concerned with observing the world around him and attempting to make sense of it as best he could. In his Ethics, he is concerned with studying that peculiar part of the world we call man. Insofar as human beings are part of God's creation, we ought to expect that studying human nature and human actions will likewise yield knowledge. Finally, we believe the Apostle Paul's teaching in Romans 2 that all men, in some sense, have the law of God written in their hearts. Now, exploring the full implications of this doctrine would be a great undertaking. But Paul seems to make it clear that even without biblical revelation, Gentiles, literally Greeks, can know the law of God to an extent. This is because their consciences bear witness to the law God has written in their hearts. The Christian reader, therefore, should be confident that there is value in reading the Nicomachean Ethics, and indeed any work of human learning, since it is the product of a man made in God's image, who lives in God's creation, and who has God's law written in his heart. As we have seen, however, this does not mean Aristotle is without error, for he is a fallen image living in a fallen world with a conscience that does not infallibly interpret God's law. We should proceed carefully, then, testing all things by the standard of God's word. And yet we should proceed as so many of our forebears in the Christian faith have, as wisely as serpents and as innocently as doves. Studying the scriptures, but willing to accept truth wherever it might be found. In addition to this potential theological difficulty, there is also a potential practical difficulty in reading the Nicomachean Ethics. In his masterful book on ethics, After Virtue, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre refers to the Nicomachean Ethics as the most brilliant lecture notes ever written. These are great accolades for Aristotle, but they also reveal something important for the reader to keep in mind as he approaches this text. The Nicomachean Ethics is essentially an edition of lecture notes Aristotle delivered to his students at the Lyceum. As lecture notes, the Nicomachean Ethics present at least two difficulties for the reader. First, they are terse and profound. Aristotle will make the most thought-provoking comment and move right along to the next idea without any further explanation. Terse. In the actual lectures, oh, to have been there, the master teacher would have taken time to explain these things to his students. We who have only the notes are often left to ourselves to fill in the missing commentary and explanation. Another difficulty in interpreting this work, and one that seems to be the opposite of the first, is that Aristotle feels free to digress frequently in the course of his exposition. That is to say, he discusses material that at times seems ancillary, if not tangential, to his argument. But if the reader keeps in mind that this is the text of a lecture, he will not be surprised by this. How many times in a class has a teacher thought of an example, formed a connection, or made an allusion to something that might seem unimportant to an outsider, but was quite appropriate in the context of the class? We can all probably think of any number of these occasions. This is doubtless the case with Aristotle's teaching. Keeping this in mind, the reader might find that he is delighted rather than distracted by Aristotle's digressions. About worldview. Anyone familiar with thinking about worldview issues is accustomed to asking three important questions of any work he reads. What is the author assuming about the nature of reality? What does he or she assume about whether and how I can know it? What does the author think I should do? There are whole branches of philosophy dedicated to dealing with each one of these questions. In fact, the study of philosophy is customarily divided into three main branches corresponding to these three questions. The first question covers the discipline that philosophers, following Aristotle's coinage, call metaphysics. This branch of philosophy studies existence and the natures of God, man, and the world. The second question covers the discipline we call epistemology. The branch of philosophy that tries to discern such things as whether anything can be known, what knowledge is, and how a person arrives at knowledge. The final question covers the discipline we call ethics and is concerned with what a person ought to do and how he or she ought to do it. So there are three traditional branches of philosophy and three worldview questions associated with them. For the remainder of this essay, we will interact with the worldview Aristotle has given expression to in his Nicomachean Ethics, discussing it in terms of his metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And as we do so, however, it is important to keep in mind that we will be distinguishing things that in reality are never separate. Our understanding of reality, metaphysics, for example, is always affecting both our view of knowledge, epistemology, and of what we ought to do, ethics. The same is true of the effect our ethics have on our metaphysics and our epistemology, and so forth. All three are always present together and, as it were, interpenetrate one another. Ontology. What is reality? What does Aristotle assume about the natures of God, the world, and man? When we seek to discern Aristotle's theology, what he assumes about the nature of God, it comes perhaps as a surprise that he doesn't seem to be concerned with deity at all in his discussion. It is commonplace for Christians to associate ethics, the study of human actions, with theology. God is, after all, very concerned with human actions, how we live our lives, and the choices we make. This is due to the fact that although we are distinct from God by our very essence as created beings, we are nevertheless made in God's image after his likeness. Furthermore, he has assumed our human nature in the incarnation, and he is also the source of all goodness, truth, and beauty in the universe. For the Christian thinker, then, the study of ethics must be connected with theology, because God is goodness himself. Not so for Aristotle. Although it was not uncommon in ancient Greek culture to view the gods as being concerned with human actions, think of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the Greeks did not seem to think there was any necessary relationship between them. That is to say, for the Greeks, man is not made in some god's image. The gods are not themselves the standard of right and wrong, and it is not to the gods that a man must give account of his life after death. Not to mention the fact that there was no authoritative revelation from the gods upon which to base any certain knowledge. In Greek thought, the gods were concerned with human actions only insofar as those actions affected them. Consider an example from the opening of Homer's Iliad. Apollo was very angered by the fact that Achilles abducted Briseis, the daughter of Croesus, but not because of the immorality of taking a girl captive. Apollo was angry with Achilles' action simply because Chryses was Apollo's priest. Apollo was merely taking Chryses' side. Whether Achilles' actions were right or wrong just did not come up. As Christians, we find Aristotle's theology quite foreign, though we can perhaps understand the lack of emphasis he places on the gods. Greek mythology is, after all, at best, the result of the corrupt speculation of men, and at worst, the result of demonic deception. It is no surprise, then, that a man striving to understand the good, even in the form that a fallen mind can perceive it, would have to leave this mythology behind. It simply cannot bear the weight of the truth. When we consider Aristotle's cosmology, what he thinks about the nature of the world, however, we find something with which we are much more familiar. For Aristotle, ours is a real world, a rational world, and a moral world. Plato, you might recall, thought that the world of our experience, the world we touch with our hands, see with our eyes, hear with our ears, and so forth, is largely an illusion. It is an unsubstantial copy or image of ideal reality. Such a world is not and could not be the proper object of knowledge. Aristotle, however, thought that this world we experience with our senses is, in fact, a substantial reality. If anything is real, then the world is certainly real, and so are we. Because our world is real, it is also rational. That is, it makes sense and can be known. We do not think of it very often, but the fact that studying the particular events in our experience allows us to come to a general knowledge of things is really staggering. It is truly astounding that by studying this particular tree, this horse, or this rock, we come to learn things about trees, horses, and rocks in general. As we will see more clearly when we study his epistemology, Aristotle assumes all along this knowability of the world. Our world, finally, is a moral one, and this fact has two important consequences. First of all, the practice of virtue, which for Aristotle means living according to reason, will really lead to the good life, and folly will really bring failure. Second, morality can be derived from nature. That is to say, what ought to be the case, ethics, morality, is derived from what is the case, metaphysics, being. Aristotle will tell us, for example, that we ought to devote our leisure to the use of reason and the acquisition of wisdom. Why? Because man by nature is a rational animal. We share all our other characteristics with other creatures, save our reason, except our reason. Thus, argues Aristotle, reason is understood as the perfection of the other qualities of man and should be developed. In short, for Aristotle, abilities imply obligations. Epistemology. What is truth? Aristotle's epistemology is widely known and is captured famously in Raphael's masterpiece, The School of Athens. This painting, the reader will recall, depicts many of the famous philosophers of ancient Greece gathered variously in a large ambulatory. There are a good number of sages present, but the painting clearly draws our attention to the center, where Plato and Aristotle are walking, books in hand, engaged in philosophical dialogue. There are a number of fascinating things about this painting, but two are of particular significance for us here. First, our two philosophers are carrying the books for which they were most noted during the Renaissance. Plato carries his dialogue, Timaeus, while Aristotle holds the Nicomachean Ethics. Second, and more importantly, Plato and Aristotle are depicted in curious though significant, postures. Plato stands looking to Aristotle with his index finger extended upward to the heavens. Aristotle, returning the gaze, stands open-handed with fingers extended toward the ground. With these images, Raphael brilliantly captures the profound distinction between Plato's and Aristotle's worldviews. Plato, believing this multifaceted and ever-changing world to be but a copy of the ideal realm, directs our attention toward the heavens to contemplate this unchanging and unified truth. Aristotle, on the other hand, understands this world, though given to multiplicity and change, to be the proper object of man's knowledge. He thus directs our gaze earthward toward the things around us. Aristotle, in fact, is often called the philosopher of this world. He does not doubt that human beings have minds and souls and that truth is eternal and unchanging. Yet he understands that we are irreducible complexes of body and soul, mind and matter, and that our theory of knowledge must take this into account. When we do, two things become clear immediately. All our knowledge is derived from or somehow dependent upon our senses, and we learn best by doing or making things ourselves. Philosophers often call the former type of knowledge empirical knowledge, while the latter is called poetic knowledge, from the Greek word poiesis, doing or making. These two facts are the foci around which Aristotle's epistemology revolves. As such, his ethics are inductive, that is, his arguments seek to arrive at ethical principles by reasoning from observation, experience, and tradition. This contrasts with the deductive reasoning of a discipline like geometry, which proceeds from general principles to understand this circle or this triangle. Moreover, his ethics are based in poetic knowledge. The most important principles for ethics are learned by living virtuously. He claims at the beginning of his work, for example, that the man who has been well brought up has or can easily get starting points for ethical reasoning. In fact, for Aristotle, almost all of the starting points for the particular disciplines, he calls them first principles, are derived neither from deductive nor inductive reasoning, but from intuition, the name Aristotle gives to the process whereby we arrive at poetic knowledge. The discipline this applies to par excellence is ethics. One final item we must discuss here is Aristotle's notion about the limits of certainty. He assumes in the Nicomachean Ethics that goodness itself is objective. Good is simply good and bad is simply bad. He notes, however, that the knowledge we gain about it through reasoning is only probable. It is only true for the most part, or to a point. By reasoning about it, we cannot have complete certainty whether an action is good or bad. Why not? Aristotle explains that there are two basic ways of reasoning through an argument: deduction, reasoning from first principles, and induction, reasoning to first principles. The former kind of reasoning, which is the domain of mathematics and geometry, results in certain conclusions. The latter kind of reasoning, which is that of the rhetorician, does not arrive at certainty, but results only in more or less probable conclusions. Now, our first reaction may be to identify Aristotle as some kind of proto-relativist who thinks that there are no absolute standards of right and wrong. but this would miss his point entirely. Keep in mind that Aristotle is not working from the standpoint of the revealed Word of God. He does not have any certain principles from which to base his argument. No sure guide in all matters of faith and practice. For Aristotle, moral and ethical principles are neither revealed, like the Decalogue, nor rationally self-evident, like the fact that the whole is greater than the parts, but passed down from one generation to the next and contained in the wisdom of the sages and poets. This tradition is a real mixed bag, so he acknowledges at the outset of his argument the limitations any of his conclusions will have. Interestingly, this is also the context for his discussion of poetic knowledge. He notes that it is only the person who develops good moral habits and lives righteously who will be able to recognize ethical truth when he encounters it. Hence, Aristotle encourages a life lived in humility and respect for tradition and the wisdom of previous generations. Aristotle concludes that it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. His entire work, therefore, will proceed carefully by considering the wisdom of older generations, the sayings of other philosophers, and the customs of Athens. He will consider these sources of ethical wisdom like a scientist, analyzing the data, testing hypotheses, and attempting to arrive at general conclusions. Ethics. How should we live? Aristotle speaks of man as being a political animal by nature. Humans are relational and in a profound sense are not fully human unless they are living in community with other people. As Greeks living prior to the revelation of Jesus Christ, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle have no higher aspirations than to live well within the Greek polis, or city-state. Aristotle's ethics are the first part of his politics. He says as much in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. And here is the painting. In the School of Athens, Italian painter Raphael brilliantly captures the profound distinction between Plato's and Aristotle's worldview. Plato points heavenward to the realm of the ideals, while Aristotle, holding a copy of his Nicomachean Ethics, directs our gaze toward the earth and the things around us. Plato's celebrated Republic presents the well-ordered society as the goal of philosophy. Ethics, then, is the goal of personal formation and one of man's most important studies. It may strike the Christian reader that Aristotle saw man's highest goal as living the good life within the polis, for we know rightly that man was created for fellowship with God the Father and Son, and with each other, through the power of the Holy Spirit. It is a great shame that Aristotle and Plato, to use St. Paul's words from Acts 17, were left to grope in the darkness after the truth of God. We should, however, note the profound truth that Aristotle understood concerning man. Although Aristotle completely lacks the concept of creation and the particular emphasis of man's being created in God's image, he does nevertheless perceive the inherent dignity of man. Man, for him, is an animal endowed with reason, and as such his actions have both purpose and gravity. Among living beings, man is unique in the fact that his actions have a moral quality and render him liable to praise or blame. Now, thoughtful Christians disagree as to the virtue of Aristotle's view of man. Many have argued that he thought of man as an autonomous being, and was actually at fault for attempting to build his philosophy on the basis of reason apart from his religion. But this is to fail to understand Aristotle's context. The ancient Greek religion was, as we noted above, an inconsistently compiled set of what is at best corrupt human tradition, and at worst, demonic ritual. In the most profound sense, then, the turn to reason and philosophy from pagan mythology is as a means to living justly was actually an affirmation of the dignity of man made in God's image. We do not know how Aristotle would have responded to the word of God proclaimed by the apostles and prophets if he could have heard it. What we do know, however, is that many who sought the truth in philosophy rather than pagan Greek mythology received the word of the apostles and evangelists gladly when in the fullness of time they did hear the gospel preached. Furthermore, Aristotle did not have the concept of faith and righteousness we have as Christians. He did, however, think that man's happiness lay in living virtuously and acting justly. In fact, he contends in chapter 8 of book 1 that man's happiness is contingent both on performing just actions and in taking pleasure in performing just actions. That is, he thought both man's outward acts and his inward disposition to be significant in moral actions. This is quite in line with the biblical teaching about the law. Taken as a standard of life, Aristotle is certainly wanting. He fails to comprehend the most fundamental truths of man's origin and his destiny in Christ. He does, however, express profound truths and remarkable insights about human nature. We will close our discussion of his worldview by examining a few of his most significant ideas. First, Aristotle perceived that man acts teleologically. That is, all of man's actions are directed toward attaining some end or goal. This comes as no surprise. A rational creature would, after all, think about what he was going to do before he did it. But Aristotle takes it further. He says that simple reflection shows us that most of these goals are themselves mere means to another end. Unless we are going to retract our first premise and say that all our actions are merely an endless chain of getting to the next purposeless cog in a wheel, we have to admit there is some telos or goal toward which we ultimately direct all our actions. This goal Aristotle terms the good of man and identifies it as eudaimonia, a Greek word that has been translated variously as happiness, the good life, and flourishing. In any case, man is moving toward a goal, and this goal is his own good, the perfection of his natural inclinations. This brings us to the second point. Aristotle's ethics are grounded in nature. Man has a concrete nature. He is a rational animal, and according to that nature, he is proceeding to the ultimate goal, telos, of the good life, eudaimonia. Therefore, there is a right way and a wrong way to achieve this goal, and this will be determined, argues Aristotle, by reflection upon man's nature. Man is a rational animal, and thus his happiness must address man as both an animal and a rational being. As we read his argument, we will see that man must have a certain degree of health, companionship, possessions, and wealth in order to be happy. Who could be happy, he asks, if he were starving? And yet, man's purpose is not located merely in material or bodily goods. His goal is to live according to reason, and this means living virtuously. But how are we to live reasonably, virtuously? How are we to discern between right and wrong? Aristotle answers these questions, all the while maintaining the antithesis between right and wrong, and still allowing for the use of reason and discernment by his famous doctrine of the mean. In Book 2, chapters 6 through 9, he formulates a standard for judging between virtue and vice, but he does so not by proposing a set of timeless absolute laws. Rather, he argues that virtuous living takes wisdom and prudence, the ability to discern the proper action with respect to the circumstance and the motivation. Right actions, he maintains, are those that stand as an intermediate point between two extremes, an extreme of excess and an extreme of deficiency. With respect to the giving and taking of money, for example, Aristotle notes that both miserliness, which is hoarding money, and prodigality, which is careless indulgence, both are vices. Miserliness is a vice of deficiency with respect both to the acquisition and the use of money, whereas prodigality is a vice of excess in the same category. The virtuous use of money, what Aristotle calls liberality, is the reasonable middle between these extremes. For the man possessed of liberality neither hoards nor carelessly spends, for he knows by the prudence gained from experience when to save and when to spend. By Kevin W. Clark.